The trial had cast a long shadow over the small Midwestern town of Brookhaven, the kind of place where church bells marked the hours and neighbors knew the color of each other's curtains. Normally, life moved slowly here, mornings filled with the hiss of sprinklers and the rustle of newspapers, afternoons punctuated by the distant whir of lawnmowers, and evenings ending with porch lights glowing against the twilight. But all of that had changed in the weeks since the arrest. A mechanic named Thomas Granger, a man who had fixed half the cars in town and coached Little League on Saturdays, now stood accused of a crime that sent shockwaves through the community. The case was ugly, the kind of story parents whispered about after sending their kids to bed. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some claimed the evidence against him was undeniable. Others insisted the police had rushed to judgment. By the time the trial began, Brookhaven no longer felt like itself. The familiar streets carried a heavy silence, as though the whole town was holding its breath. Every morning, the courthouse steps filled with spectators. Retired farmers, school teachers on summer break, teenagers eager for drama, all pressed close for a glimpse of the accused. Reporters from neighboring counties parked vans along Main Street, their satellite dishes stabbing the sky. Cameras flashed as Thomas Granger was led inside, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the ground. To some, he looked like a guilty man avoiding the gaze of his neighbors. To others, he looked broken, weighed down by the knowledge that his reputation and perhaps his freedom was unraveling. Inside, the courtroom was a crucible of tension. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of people who rarely attended trials, but now sat shoulder to shoulder, unwilling to miss even a moment. The air smelled faintly of polish and old paper. A ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, stirring the heat of summer, yet it did little to cool tempers or nerves. A judge presided with stern patience, his gavel ready for order when whispers swelled too loudly. The prosecution came armed with confidence. They displayed photographs, presented timelines, and spoke with a cadence that suggested inevitability. To hear them tell it, Thomas's guilt was beyond question. Their centerpiece was the testimony of a police canine named Ranger, a German shepherd with a gleaming coat and an air of authority. Ranger's alert during the investigation had led officers to what they claimed was critical evidence. Jurors leaned forward every time the dog's name was mentioned, their expressions softening with trust. A police dog was like a symbol of truth, unbiased, loyal, and incapable of deceit. The defense, however, urged caution. They argued that the case was more fragile than it appeared, that procedures had been sloppy, that assumptions had been made too quickly. Yet their words seemed to evaporate against the weight of the prosecution's narrative. Most in the gallery dismissed these objections as desperate attempts from a defense team grasping at straws. And then there was Emily. She was mentioned only in passing during opening statements, a child witness, just 8 years old, who had been nearby on the day in question. The prosecution downplayed her role, suggesting she was too young to offer anything reliable. The defense hinted that she might notice details others had missed, but they did not press the point. In the bustle of the trial, her name drifted into the background like a faint echo, drowned by louder voices. No one in that courtroom yet understood how important she would become. Still, the town buzzed with speculation. In diners and barbershops, at church picnics and gas stations, conversations circled endlessly back to the trial. "You think he did it?" someone would ask over a cup of coffee. "Well, the dog said so, didn't it?" another would reply, as though Ranger himself had spoken from the witness stand. Those who knew Thomas personally wrestled with doubt. He had fixed their transmissions, waved at them in parades, shown up with casseroles when neighbors were grieving. Could that same man truly be guilty of what the papers suggested? Families divided over dinner tables. Friendships strained under the weight of differing opinions. The trial was no longer just about one man's guilt or innocence. It had become a mirror reflecting the town's own fears and judgments. To believe Thomas was guilty was to accept that darkness had been hiding in plain sight. To believe he was innocent was to suggest that the system they trusted had faltered. Neither truth sat comfortably. The courthouse itself seemed to embody the tension. On the second week of testimony, a storm rolled through, rain hammering the windows while thunder rattled the roof. Lightning illuminated the room in sharp flashes, casting long shadows against the paneled walls. It felt as though nature itself was echoing the unease that clung to every corner. Even the jurors shifted in their seats, their faces drawn with the weight of what they were being asked to decide. And yet, amid all the noise, the attorney's sharp words, the reporters tapping keyboards, the judge's measured commands, there was a stillness waiting beneath. A sense that something unseen, something overlooked, might yet surface. Emily, sitting quietly with her mother on a wooden bench outside the courtroom, fidgeted with the ears of her stuffed rabbit. She didn't understand the legal jargon swirling around her. She only knew what she had seen and what she remembered. While the grown-ups debated guilt and innocence with heavy voices, she carried her truth silently, waiting for the moment someone would ask. The town of Brookhaven had no idea that the balance of the trial, the fate of Thomas Granger, and the confidence of an entire community in its justice system would soon hinge not on the polished speeches of lawyers or the firm bark of a police dog, but on the quiet observation of a little girl. At that moment, part one of the story was still unfolding, an atmosphere thick with doubt, anticipation, and fear. The town was tense, the trial relentless, and the truth buried beneath layers of assumption. All that remained was for one voice, small but certain, to pierce the silence and change everything. Emily Harper was not the kind of child most people noticed. At 8 years old, she was small for her age, with wisps of blonde hair that never quite stayed pinned back and wide gray eyes that seemed older than the rest of her. She carried herself with a quietness that made her blend into the corners of rooms, the kind of stillness adults mistook for shyness. Yet those who knew her best, her mother, her teacher, her grandmother, understood that Emily's silence was not emptiness but observation. She absorbed the world around her like a sponge, storing details others brushed past. In school, Emily rarely raised her hand. But when she did, her answers startled her classmates. Where others gave short responses, she described things with striking precision. Once, when her class was asked to draw a memory from summer vacation, most children sketched stick figures at swimming pools. Emily drew her uncle's farm in such detail that her teacher swore she could count every window pane on the barn. She didn't chatter or exaggerate. She simply recorded, like a camera with a heartbeat. It was this quality, her gift for noticing, that made her presence at the trial so unusual. Children were rarely called as witnesses in Brookhaven. The courtroom was a place of stern voices and adult arguments, not the gentle, halting speech of the young. Yet Emily had been there, nearby on the day of the incident, and the defense insisted her memory might shed light on the truth. Her mother, Sarah Harper, was torn. The thought of Emily sitting in that vast, intimidating room filled her with dread. Sarah remembered her own childhood fear of authority, the towering judge's bench, the sharp creak of doors, the way all eyes turned at once. How would her little girl endure it? Yet Sarah also knew Emily's integrity. If her daughter said she remembered something, she did. And sometimes, Sarah thought, the truth needed the voice of someone untainted by the cynicism of adults. When word spread that a child would testify, the town buzzed with curiosity. In coffee shops, patrons leaned in to whisper, "What could a little girl possibly know?" Others speculated that she had seen something crucial. Skeptics dismissed Her as unreliable. Kids imagine things, they said. Supporters countered. Kids also notice things we don't. They don't lie the way adults do. By the time the trial reached its second week, Emily had become a point of fascination, even before she spoke a single word. On the morning she was scheduled to appear, the courthouse atmosphere changed. The usual murmur of anticipation carried a different edge, softer, more curious. Reporters shifted in their seats, pencils poised. Jurors glanced at each other, wondering what to expect. And in the front row, Sarah held her daughter's small hand, squeezing it gently, whispering encouragement. Emily clutched her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Whiskers, a frayed toy with one ear bent permanently sideways. The judge had granted her permission to bring it for comfort. Some in the gallery smiled at the sight. Others frowned, believing it was a distraction. But for Emily, Mr. Whiskers was armor. The bailiff called her name, and the little girl stepped forward, her shoes tapping lightly against the polished floor. She climbed into the witness chair, her legs swinging far above the ground. The judge leaned slightly forward, his stern features softening as he explained the importance of telling the truth. Emily nodded solemnly, her gaze fixed on his black robe. She promised she would. At first, her voice was barely audible. She confirmed her name, her age, and where she went to school. She spoke about her favorite subject, art, and how she liked to draw trees with branches that spread like rivers. The courtroom softened at her innocence. Even the most skeptical jurors found themselves smiling. Yet beneath the gentle questions lay an undercurrent of seriousness. Everyone knew the adults weren't there to hear about crayons. They wanted details about the night of the incident. Emily's eyes darted to her mother, then to the rows of strangers watching. She fiddled with Mr. Whiskers' ear, taking comfort in the familiar texture. When asked if she remembered being near the scene, she nodded. Slowly, haltingly, she began to describe what she had noticed: the sounds, the people, the movements. Her words were not polished, but they carried a clarity that made the room lean closer. She spoke like someone replaying a picture in her mind, careful not to miss even the smallest brushstroke. For many in the audience, it was the first time they considered the possibility that a child's perspective might carry weight. Children did not bend facts to fit arguments. They did not use rhetoric or strategy. They simply reported what they saw. And while Emily's story was still unfolding, there was something in her tone, an unvarnished honesty, that made listeners uneasy. The prosecution, though outwardly polite, exchanged wary glances. They had planned to dismiss her testimony as irrelevant, but her quiet certainty posed a problem. If the jury believed her, even a detail out of step with their narrative could weaken the case. The defense, by contrast, sat straighter, sensing that this small witness might become their unexpected anchor. Yet no one, not the judge, not the attorneys, not even Sarah, could anticipate what Emily would notice next. Her gaze, wandering away from the questions, landed on the police dog, Ranger, lying obediently by his handler's feet. The courtroom saw just a child glancing around nervously. But in Emily's mind, something clicked, a detail she had carried since that night, but had not yet spoken aloud. She tilted her head, frowning slightly, as though a puzzle piece had finally fallen into place. Her small lips parted, but she did not speak. Not yet. Instead, she clutched Mr. Whiskers a little tighter, holding on to the thought, waiting for the moment when someone would ask the right question. At that time, her importance remained invisible to most of the courtroom. She was just a girl, sitting with her stuffed rabbit, speaking softly into a microphone. But for those who watched closely, it was something in her stillness and energy, gathering like a held breath that suggested she was not done yet. The key witness was more than a name on the docket. She was a reminder that truth often hides in the smallest of places, waiting for the courage of a child to bring it into. The light. The first time Ranger entered the courtroom, the mood shifted instantly. He was a German shepherd of imposing stature, his coat gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, every movement deliberate and controlled. His handler, Officer David Keller, kept him on a short leather lead, guiding him to the space just beside the witness stand. Though Ranger never barked, never lunged, never growled, his very presence commanded attention. People straightened in their seats. Jurors softened, their eyes following him with quiet admiration. To them, this wasn't just a dog, it was a symbol. Police dogs, especially in small-town America, carried a reputation almost beyond reproach. They weren't burdened by human vices like lying or scheming. They represented loyalty, discipline, and truth. When a K9 alerted, the public assumed it was fact. If the dog indicated evidence was there, then evidence must be there. The prosecution understood this psychology well, and they leaned on it with practiced ease. "Ladies and gentlemen," the district attorney announced during opening statements, "Ranger has been trained to detect what most of us cannot even comprehend. His senses are sharper than any human witness. When Ranger alerts, he does not hesitate. He does not mislead. He speaks the truth in the only way he knows how." The jury nodded. Some even smiled faintly at the dog, as though reassured by his steady gaze. He wasn't just part of the case. He was the case's heart, its living proof. Officer Keller took the stand on the third day of testimony, his crisp uniform pressed and his voice measured. He spoke of Ranger's training, his countless successful searches, his years of service to the community. He described the night Ranger had led investigators to a location where crucial evidence was found. Keller recounted it with authority. Ranger's nose stiffening, his tail stiff, his sudden alert near a discarded item that prosecutors claimed tied directly to Thomas Granger. "The dog doesn't make mistakes," Keller said confidently. "Not my dog." Those words carried weight. They echoed in the minds of the jurors. How could anyone doubt such loyalty, such certainty? For many in the courtroom, the case might as well have ended there. But beneath the surface, doubt flickered like a candle flame. The defense attorney, a wiry man named Paul Morton, did not smile when Ranger padded into the courtroom. He studied the dog intently, his brow furrowed, as if measuring not just the animal, but the story being built around him. Morton knew what the jury did not. Police dogs, as remarkable as they were not perfect. Alerts could be influenced, sometimes even unconsciously, by their handlers. Training could vary. Records were not always as clean as prosecutors wanted the public to believe. Yet Morton also knew it would take more than cross-examination to unravel the halo surrounding Ranger. To challenge a police dog in court was to risk looking desperate, even absurd. Who would a jury trust more, a defense lawyer trying to save his client or a German shepherd trained to serve? Still, Morton began to probe. "Officer Keller," he asked during cross-examination, "isn't it true that dogs can sometimes give false alerts?" Keller stiffened. "Not Ranger. He's never failed." "Never?" Morton pressed, his voice even. "Never," Keller repeated. The jurors looked impressed, but Morton caught the subtle pause before the word left the officer's lips. It was only a fraction of a second, but it was there, a hesitation, small yet telling. Morton shifted his strategy. Instead of attacking Ranger directly, he began laying groundwork. He asked about the department's other canine, a younger dog, named Max. He inquired about records, about how evidence was logged, about how easily confusion could arise when multiple units were in play. The prosecution objected several times, accusing him of trying to muddy the waters. But Morton persisted, planting seeds of uncertainty. Meanwhile, Ranger remained the silent star of the trial. Children in the gallery craned their necks to see him. Adults whispered about his discipline. Reporters scribbled descriptions of his calm demeanor. One headline the next morning read, "Hero Dog Key to Brookhaven Trial." For Thomas Granger, sitting at the defense table, Ranger's presence was both surreal and crushing. He had lived in Brookhaven all his life, had fixed bicycles for neighborhood kids, repaired farm equipment in the dead of winter, and now here he was, his fate seemingly balanced on the nose of a dog. He glanced at the German shepherd and wondered bitterly how he had ended up in this place, how his life had narrowed down to a single animal's movements. In town, the symbolism spread further. People spoke of Ranger as though he were a witness. Who could testify with words? The dog wouldn't lie, neighbors said to one another at the grocery store. The dog found something. That's enough for me. Yet those who studied Emily sitting quietly with her stuffed rabbit in the courtroom, Hughes noticed her eyes drifting toward Ranger too. Not with admiration, not with the awe others felt, but with a faint, puzzled curiosity. To her, the dog wasn't a hero or a symbol. He was just a dog. And something about him wasn't right. That detail hadn't surfaced yet. Emily hadn't spoken. The attorneys hadn't asked. But deep in her memory, a picture lingered, a picture of a different dog on the night the investigation unfolded. A dog with markings that didn't match the one sitting beside Officer Keller. The courtroom, oblivious to her small frown, continued to marvel at Ranger's reliability. The judge moved the trial forward, testimony stacked on testimony, the prosecution's story reinforced by the weight of the canine's silent authority. But beneath the surface of certainty, cracks were forming, cracks invisible to most, but clear as day to one little girl. For now, Ranger remained untouchable, the cornerstone of the state's case. He was the loyal servant, the unerring nose, the silent witness. But soon, very soon, his role would be called into question. And when that moment came, the courtroom would not only reconsider Ranger's reliability, it would reconsider everything. The day Emily was called to the stand, the courthouse felt different. By then, the trial had settled into a steady rhythm. Lawyers sparring, witnesses answering in clipped tones, the jury listening with varying degrees of patience. But word had spread that the child witness would testify that morning, and with it came a new kind of energy. Spectators arrived earlier than usual. Lining up on the courthouse steps, their voices hushed with curiosity. The press, sensing the human interest angle, adjusted their cameras toward the doors, eager to capture the moment when the smallest figure in the trial would enter. Inside the courtroom, the judge seemed sterner than usual, as if anticipating disruption. He tapped his gavel once, not to restore order, but to remind everyone who commanded the room. "We will proceed with respect," he warned, his eyes scanning the benches crowded with onlookers. This is not a spectacle. Yet even he knew that, in some way, it was. Emily walked in holding her mother's hand, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. The gallery softened at the sight. A small figure with pigtails, wide-eyed and hesitant, in a room full of polished shoes and pressed suits. Some spectators smiled sympathetically. Others shook their heads, muttering that it was unfair to put a child through such pressure. The jurors watched her carefully, their expressions shifting from curiosity to protectiveness. Even the most skeptical among them could not help but see her as vulnerable, fragile, and honest by nature. Sarah Harper, Emily's mother, leaned down and whispered words of comfort as they reached the front. Emily nodded slightly, though her grip on the stuffed rabbit tightened. She had been told that Mr. Whiskers would be allowed to stay with her while she testified. The judge, understanding the importance of comfort, had agreed despite the prosecution's objection. "The child will answer questions more clearly if she feels safe," he explained, silencing further argument. The bailiff lifted Emily gently into the witness chair. Her feet dangled far above the floor, swinging nervously as she settled in. A microphone was angled toward her, its looming presence making her flinch at first. The judge leaned forward, his voice softening. "Emily," he said kindly, "you understand you must tell the truth today?" "Yes, sir," she whispered. "Do you promise to do that?" "Yes." Her voice was faint, but firm enough to be recorded, and with that, the questioning began. At first, the attorneys kept it simple. The defense attorney asked her name, her age, what grade she was in at school. Emily answered timidly, clutching Mr. Whiskers with one hand. She said her favorite subject was art, that she liked drawing trees with big branches, and that her teacher gave her gold stars for neat coloring. The courtroom relaxed. For a moment, it felt less like a trial and more like a classroom recital. But the tone shifted as the questions edged closer to the night in question. "Emily," the defense attorney said gently, "do you remember being near the street the night the officers came?" She nodded. "Can you tell us what you saw?" Her eyes flicked to her mother, who nodded encouragingly. Emily took a small breath. "I saw lights," she said. "And people. Lots of people. The cars were loud." The jury leaned in. "What else?" Emily hesitated. Her fingers twisted the rabbit's ear as she replayed the memory in her mind. "I saw a man, and I saw a dog." "A dog?" "Yes." The prosecution shifted in their seats, suddenly alert. The defense attorney glanced briefly at Ranger, lying obediently beside his handler, before turning back to Emily. "Can you ascribe the dog?" Emily's brow furrowed, and for the first time, her quiet composure shifted into something more intent. "He was big, like him," she said, pointing to Ranger. The courtroom relaxed again. A murmur swept through the gallery. Of course, she meant the police dog. But Emily's gaze lingered, her head tilting slightly, as though comparing two images. In her mind, the defense attorney pressed carefully. "Emily, are you saying this dog was there that night?" Emily frowned. She clutched Mr. Whiskers closer, as though the rabbit might help her find the right words. Her voice, when it came, was soft but certain. "Not him." The room froze. For a moment, the words seemed to hang in the air, too light and too strange to carry meaning. The judge blinked, his gavel hovering above the block. The jury exchanged startled glances. The defense attorney blinked, caught between triumph and disbelief. The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Objection!" Leading the witness. But Emily wasn't finished. Her small finger pointed directly at Ranger, her gray eyes steady despite her trembling hands. "That's not the dog I saw." A ripple of shock coursed through the room. Reporters scrambled for their notepads. Spectators gasped audibly, the sound swelling like a wave. The handler stiffened, his hand tightening on the leash as if to ground himself. Ranger remained motionless, calm as ever, his dark eyes unblinking. The judge brought his gavel down sharply. "Order! Order in this courtroom!" Silence returned, but it was the brittle silence of shock, as if the entire room had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. The defense attorney crouched slightly, lowering his voice so as not to overwhelm the child. "Emily, can you tell us what you mean?" Emily nodded slowly. Her voice trembled, but her certainty did not. "The dog that night didn't have that mark." She pointed again, this time to Ranger's chest, where a white patch of fur gleamed like a badge against his otherwise dark coat. "The dog I saw was all black there, no white." Her words hit harder than any argument the lawyers had crafted. This wasn't strategy. This wasn't rhetoric. This was a child describing what she had seen, with the plain honesty of someone who had no stake in persuasion. The prosecution objected again, this time with more urgency. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. She's a child. She's mistaken. Dogs look alike, but the seed had been planted, and it was growing fast. The jury's faces betrayed them. Doubt had entered the room. Emily sat quietly, Mr. Whiskers cradled against her chest, unaware of the storm she had unleashed. To her, she had simply told the truth. But in that truth, the entire trajectory of the trial had shifted. For the first time since it began, Thomas Granger lifted his head at the defense table, his eyes widening with something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. The smallest witness in the room had just cracked the case wide open. The words were so small, so ordinary, that most people almost didn't register them at first. Wrong dog. 2 syllables. Spoken in a voice so soft, barely carried beyond the microphone. And yet, when those words left Emily Harper's mouth, they detonated like a firecracker in the stillness of the courtroom. For a fraction of a second, there was silence so complete it felt unnatural. The hum of the lights seemed louder, the shuffle of papers sharper. Jurors froze mid-breath. Spectators stared, wide-eyed, as if unsure whether they had heard her correctly. Even the stenographer's fingers hovered for a beat, suspended above the keys. And came the collective intake of air. A gasp rippled through the gallery like a wave, swelling, cresting, and crashing in whispered disbelief. Did she say? She said the dog was wrong dog. The judge slammed his gavel down hard, the sharp crack echoing off the paneled walls. Order! Order in this courtroom. He barked, though his own eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise. At the defense table, Paul Morton leaned back slowly, his pulse quickening. For weeks, he had searched for cracks in the prosecution's fortress of evidence, had chipped at procedures and questioned testimony, but nothing had struck like this. 2 words from a child had done more damage than hours of his legal arguments. Across the aisle, the prosecution was in disarray. The district attorney's face flushed crimson as he leapt to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is outrageous. The witness is a child. She doesn't understand the weight of her words. But the objection rang hollow. Everyone in the room had heard the clarity in Emily's tone. She hadn't stumbled or second-guessed. She had pointed at Ranger, the supposed star witness, and declared with certainty that he was not the dog she remembered. Officer Keller, Ranger's handler, stiffened. His hand twitched on the leash, though Ranger himself remained calm, ears pricked, eyes steady. The dog didn't know. He had just become the center of the storm, the fulcrum on which the trial might now pivot. The judge raised his hand to silence the courtroom. The objection is noted, but the child will be allowed to clarify. He turned toward Emily, his voice softening slightly. Young lady, what do you mean by wrong dog? Emily hugged Mr. Whiskers tightly, the rabbit's fabric ears brushing against her cheek. She looked around the room, overwhelmed by the dozens of eyes fixed on her. Yet when she spoke again, her words were steady, as if anchored by her certainty. The dog I saw that night wasn't this one. She pointed again at Ranger, her small finger unwavering. That dog didn't have white on his chest. He was all black here. Her explanation fell into the room like a stone into still water. The ripples spread outward. Through the jury box, where men and women exchanged startled looks. Through the gallery, where spectators whispered furiously. Through the defense, where Morton scribbled frantically on his notepad. And through the prosecution, where panic flashed briefly before being hidden beneath a mask of control. The district attorney tried again, his voice tight. Your Honor, with respect, this is unreliable. Dogs can appear similar. The child is misremembering. But the judge raised an eyebrow. She seems quite certain. He turned back to Emily. You're sure? Emily nodded, clutching Mr. Whiskers tighter. I remember. I saw him close. I'm not wrong. Her certainty carried more weight than anyone expected. It wasn't the polished confidence of an attorney or the rehearsed testimony of an expert witness. It was the unvarnished truth of a child who had no reason to embellish. The jurors leaned forward, their skepticism toward the defense beginning to crumble. A few even scribbled notes furiously, underlining words on their pads. Morton sensed his opening. "Your Honor, this goes directly to the integrity of the evidence. If there was confusion over which K9 unit was used, then the reliability of that evidence is fatally compromised. We request access to all records regarding the department's dogs." The prosecutor bristled. "This is a distraction, a child's imagination." But the judge cut him off. "Enough. The request is granted. Produce the records by tomorrow morning." The room erupted again, reporters scribbling furiously, spectators buzzing like a hive of bees. The gavel pounded repeatedly, but the tension could not be quelled. The trial, which had seemed so neatly in the prosecution's grasp, had just veered into uncharted waters. Through it all, Emily sat quietly, her feet still dangling above the floor, her rabbit clutched tightly in her lap. She did not fully understand the storm she had created. To her, she had simply told the truth, the same way she might tell her teacher she'd seen a bird outside the classroom window. She didn't know that her 2 words, "wrong dog," were now echoing beyond the walls of the courthouse, reshaping the entire case. For Thomas Granger, it was as though the weight pressing against his chest had lifted, just slightly. He dared not celebrate, dared not let hope consume him. But for the first time since his arrest, he felt the scales tipping. The prosecution's foundation had cracked, and it had been done not by experts or lawyers, but by the honesty of a child. In the hallway after adjournment, reporters swarmed. What did she say? Did you hear it? Wrong dog. That's going to be the headline. Microphones shoved toward attorneys. Cameras flashed, the air buzzing with questions. Some called it a turning point. Others dismissed it as a child's mistake, but everyone agreed the trial was no longer the same. That evening, as the town gathered in diners and living rooms, the phrase echoed everywhere. Over plates of fried chicken, over cups of coffee, over static-filled radio broadcasts, people repeated it with awe and disbelief. Wrong dog. It became both a joke and a revelation, a simple phrase with the power to unravel weeks of carefully built arguments. But inside the courthouse, among those who truly understood the stakes, it was no joke. Those 2 words had changed everything. The police dog, once untouchable, was now a question mark. The prosecution's narrative, once airtight, now leaked doubt. And the jury, once confident, now carried the seed of suspicion. All from the quiet voice of a little girl who had simply told the truth. The day after Emily's testimony, the courthouse was nearly bursting at the seams. Word had traveled faster than anyone anticipated. Across Brookhaven, people who had never cared for trials suddenly had an opinion. At the diner on Main Street, patrons leaned across booths whispering the phrase like it was gospel. Wrong dog. In the barbershop, men argued over whether the girl was mistaken or if the police had botched their case. Even in the schoolyard, children played out mock trials, one declaring wrong dog, while the others collapsed in laughter. But inside the courthouse, the mood was anything but playful. When court resumed, Paul Morton, the defense attorney, wasted no time. He rose with a stack of papers tucked under his arm records the judge had ordered produced the night before. His tone was calm, almost casual, but his eyes gleamed with purpose. Your Honor, he began, yesterday the witness, Emily Harper, described with striking clarity that the dog present in this courtroom was not the same dog she saw on the night in question. At your order, we reviewed the K9 unit's records, and what we found is troubling. The gallery leaned forward as Morton laid the papers on the evidence table. The jurors straightened, pens poised. Even the judge seemed more alert, as if bracing for what was to come. Morton lifted the first document. Brookhaven Police Department employs 2 active canines south. Ranger, the dog we see here, and Max, a younger German shepherd with no distinguishing white patch on his chest. According to training records, both dogs were on duty the night of the investigation. Yet the reports do not consistently identify which dog was used at which point in the search. A ripple moved through the courtroom like wind across a wheat field. Morton pressed on. In fact, one report lists Ranger's presence at the scene. Another, filed by a different officer, lists Max. There is no clear chain of identification. No photographs were taken of the search itself. We are left with contradictory paperwork and testimony that cannot be reconciled. The prosecution objected immediately. Clerical errors, Your Honor. Nothing more. The important fact remains. A dog alerted to evidence, and that evidence was found. But Morton was ready. He held up another sheet. Except, Your Honor, the logs also show that Max had only completed 6 months of training at the time, compared to Ranger's 3 years. Max was still considered a trainee, prone to false alerts. And yet the possibility exists that it was Max, not Ranger, who conducted the crucial search. That distinction matters tremendously. The jury stirred uneasily. Jurors glanced at one, another, frowning, whispering under their breath. What had seemed solid now looked messy, uncertain, human. The prosecution attempted to recover, calling Officer Keller back to the stand. Keller's face was pale but resolute. It was Ranger. He insisted, "I know my dog. I was there." Morton circled like a hawk. "And yet, officer, can you explain why your colleague's report lists Max?" Keller hesitated, jaw tightening. He must have been mistaken. "And can you explain why Emily Harper, who observed the dog at the scene, testified under oath? That it was not Ranger? She's a child," Keller snapped. "Children don't always." "Or," Morton interrupted smoothly, "perhaps she was the only one paying enough attention to notice." The exchange landed heavily. The jurors scribbled furiously. The spectators buzzed. The judge banged his gavel to silence the room, but the damage was done. Doubt had entered the bloodstream of the trial, and there was no undoing it. Over the next 2 days, experts were called. A canine behavior specialist testified that false alerts were more common than the public realized. Handlers can influence dogs unconsciously, she explained. Sometimes the dog picks up on subtle cues. It's not deception. It's just how dogs bond with their handlers. The prosecution cross-examined relentlessly, but the seed had already been planted. The K-9 evidence was not as ironclad as it first appeared. Meanwhile, Emily's quiet testimony echoed in every corner of the courtroom. Her 2 words had turned the spotlight onto sloppy police work, and every inconsistency now felt magnified. Why hadn't the department documented which dog was present? Why were reports contradictory? Why had no one noticed the detail of the white patch? Thomas Granger, who had sat through week after week of damning testimony with his shoulders hunched and eyes lowered, now began to lift his gaze. For the first time, he felt the ground shift beneath his accusers. He watched as the prosecution scrambled to patch holes in their narrative, as officers stumbled under cross-examination, as jurors leaned more skeptically toward the state's table. The gallery, too, had changed. Once filled with certainty, the whispers now carried unease. If they mixed up the dogs, what else did they mix up? If the girl's right about this, what else might she be right about? Even the reporters, once eager to paint Ranger as a flawless hero, now wrote with sharper pens. Headlines shifted. Confusion over canine evidence. Dog mix-up rocks Brookhaven trial. By the end of the week, the prosecution's once uncheckable case was bleeding credibility. Their reliance on Ranger, once a strength, had become a liability, but the greatest impact was not on the lawyers or the reporters. It was on the jury. 12 men and women who had once nodded confidently at the mention of Ranger's name now sat with furrowed brows, their notes crowded with question marks. They could no longer see the case as simple, no longer believe in the neat story they had been told, and all of it traced back to a child's clear-eyed observation. Emily had not intended to unravel the case. She hadn't studied evidence or parsed testimony. She had simply remembered what she saw and had the courage to say it aloud. Yet in doing so, she had revealed a fault line running through the prosecution's foundation, a crack that widened with every passing day. By the time court adjourned on Friday, the trial was no longer the same trial. What had begun as a straightforward march toward conviction was now a maze of contradictions and unanswered questions. The police, once symbols of certainty, were now under suspicion. The jury, once confident, now wrestled with doubt, and Thomas Granger, once all but condemned, now had hope. The truth was unraveling, not in dramatic confessions or explosive revelations, but in the slow, steady peeling back of assumptions, layer by layer, until the case that had seemed so solid began to look like it might collapse entirely. All because of a little girl who had looked at a dog and said, simply wrong. By Monday morning, the courthouse no longer carried the hum of confidence that had filled it during the first days of the trial. The air had thickened into something heavier, more uncertain. Even the routine chatter of the gallery had shifted in toneless gossip, more speculation. The phrase "wrong dog" had spread so far it felt like everyone had claimed ownership of it. But what mattered now was what those two words had done to the machinery of the case. The prosecution came in armed to repair the damage, but the cracks were too wide, and the defense had every intention of pulling them further apart. When Judge Carter took his seat, Paul Morton rose immediately, holding yet another file in his hand. His voice was calm, but carried steel underneath. Your Honor, after careful review of additional discovery, we've uncovered more troubling inconsistencies regarding the canine evidence. The district attorney groaned audibly, but Morton ignored him. He held up the file like a dagger. This, he said, is a logbook entry from the night of the search. It clearly records Max the Younger, untested K9, as being deployed during the evidence search. The entry is signed not by Officer Keller, but by Officer Daniels, who has since claimed, under oath, he never handled Max at that scene. This isn't just confusion, Your Honor. This is a direct contradiction. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Even the jurors, who had been trained to keep their expressions neutral, let their eyebrows rise. The prosecution objected instantly. Clerical. Mistake again. It happens. Morton's eyes flashed. A mistake, Your Honor, is forgetting to dot an I. This is perjury or incompetence, and either undermines the credibility of the state's case. Judge Carter studied the file, lips pressed thin. Mr. District Attorney, how do you explain this discrepancy? The DA sputtered. We will need time to review. Time? Morton pounced. The state has had this evidence for months. The defense only just received it, and already the inconsistencies are obvious. What else has been overlooked or concealed? The word concealed hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Concealment implied intent. Intent implied misconduct. DA leapt up. That's outrageous. The defense is implying bad faith without proof, but the damage was already done. The jurors leaned back, skepticism etched on their faces. Reporters scribbled furiously, pencils nearly tearing through their pads. The spectators buzzed like bees trapped in a jar. Morton sat down slowly, satisfied. He didn't need to win the war in that moment. He just needed to keep bleeding the prosecution's case until it collapsed under its own weight. Over the next hours, testimony after testimony unraveled further. Officer Keller, once stoic and unshakable, now seemed cornered. Under Morton's cross-examination, he contradicted himself twice. first insisting Ranger had been there the entire time, then admitting Max had accompanied them earlier in the evening. But it was Ranger who alerted, he repeated desperately. Sweat glistening under the courtroom lights, Morton tilted his head. You're certain? Yes. Certain enough to send a man to prison for life? Keller swallowed hard. The silence that followed was deafening. The jury wrote furiously. Then came the canine training records. The defense called an expert, who had reviewed both Ranger's and Max's files. She spoke with clinical precision, her glasses sliding down her nose. Ranger was certified, yes. But Max, at the time of the search, had failed 2 of his last 5 training drills. In particular, he struggled with distinguishing trace sense from environmental contamination. False positives, in plain terms. Meaning? Morton asked. Meaning. If Max was the one who performed the search, the evidence he supposedly alerted to cannot be considered reliable. The jurors murmured. The judge banged his gavel. The prosecution flailed, objecting on technical grounds. But the expert's testimony stood. Piece by piece, the scaffolding of the prosecution's narrative buckled. The K-9 unit, once painted as a flawless tool of justice, now appeared sloppy, confused, and possibly corrupted. The jury had been promised certainty. Now they were staring at chaos. And then came the final blow. Late that afternoon, the defense called a surprise witness, Officer Daniels, a man whose name appeared on the disputed log entry. He was reluctant, nervous, clearly uncomfortable. Under oath. Morton's voice was soft, almost sympathetic, but every question was a scalpel. Officer Daniels, you signed the log that night, did you not? Yes. And you listed Max, not Ranger. Yes, but it was late. I may have. Please, just answer. Did you list Max? Yes. Why? Daniels hesitated. Because Max was there. The gallery gasped. The prosecution leapt up, shouting objections, but Judge Carter waved them down. Let him finish. Daniels shifted uncomfortably. Look, it was chaos that night. People wanted results fast. Max was brought in, but Keller didn't want it in the official record. Side Ranger's reputation was stronger. So, he told me to write Ranger later. I shouldn't have signed it that way, but he trailed off, his eyes falling to the table. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a whisper, not a shuffle. Just the collective realization that the foundation of the state's case had just crumbled before their eyes. Paul Morton straightened his tie. No further questions. The prosecution tried desperately to rehabilitate Daniels on cross, but the damage was irreversible. The words Keller told me to write Ranger hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. The jury's faces told the story. Shock, betrayal, doubt, and for Thomas Granger, seated quietly beside Morton, hope bloomed so fiercely he could barely breathe. By the time court adjourned that evening, the reporters had their headlines ready. Case in crisis. Police misconduct alleged. Prosecution in freefall. The townspeople who had once condemned Granger in whispers now spoke of the trial with hesitation, uncertainty, even guilt. Inside his cell that night, Granger sat on his bunk and pressed his hands over his face. For the first time in months, he dared to believe freedom might actually be possible. Not because of his lawyer's cunning alone, not because of some miracle of evidence, but because a little girl had pointed at a dog and spoken the truth. In the defense office, Morton stared at the files scattered across his desk. He knew the battle wasn't won yet. The prosecution could still scramble, could still try to salvage something. But the collapse had begun, and momentum was now on his side. And in her small bedroom, Emily Harper tucked Mr. Whiskers under her chin and whispered, I told them. She didn't understand the full scale of what she had done, but she felt lighter, as if the world had finally listened. The case hadn't ended, but the collapse had started. And once it started, there was no stopping it. The courthouse on the final day of Thomas Granger's trial did not feel like the same building where it had all begun. The tall oak doors groaned as people pushed their way inside, a flood of townsfolk, reporters, and curious onlookers. The very walls seemed to hold their breath. No one knew how the jury would rule, but everyone knew the outcome would ripple far beyond the man on trial. Thomas sat at the defense table, his shoulders straighter than they had been in weeks. His eyes, once dulled by resignation, now glimmered with cautious hope. He had learned, painfully, not to expect mercy from strangers. But after the last week, the unraveling of reports, the contradictions in testimony, the stunning admission by Officer Daniels, he felt the scales of justice finally tipping his way. Paul Morton sat beside him, shuffling papers he didn't need to read. He already knew the closing arguments had been delivered. There was nothing more to add. His job now was to wait, to trust that doubt had taken root in the jury's minds deeply enough that it could not be dislodged. The prosecutor, by contrast, looked worn thin. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled from endless late nights, trying to salvage a narrative that had collapsed in on itself. He knew what was coming, but clung to the faint hope that the jury's natural deference to law enforcement might override the cracks. And then came the jury. The bailiff's voice rang out. All rise. 12 men and women filed into the courtroom, their faces unreadable. Some held notes, others carried nothing but their own thoughts. They moved like a single organism, and the air in the room grew taut as a pulled string. Judge Carter's gaze swept across them. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict? The foreman, a middle-aged man with square shoulders and a deliberate walk, stood. He held a folded slip of paper in his hand. We have, Your Honor. The courtroom froze. The clerk took the paper, unfolded it, and handed it back to the foreman to read aloud. In the case of the State of Brookhaven versus Thomas Granger, on the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendant. He paused, eyes darting briefly toward the defendant's table. Not guilty. Gasps rippled through the room like a wave crashing onto rocks. For a moment, it was as if time itself faltered. The foreman continued, steady now. On the charge of unlawful possession of a weapon, we find the defendant. Not guilty. Another wave of sound swept through the gallery, louder this time. Some people cheered before being silenced by the judge's gavel. And on the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant not guilty. Thomas closed his eyes. His chest heaved, and he dropped his head into his hands. Morton placed a steady hand on his client's back. The weight of months, perhaps years, of fear and stigma fell away in that single moment. The prosecution slumped, shoulders collapsing inward. The DI rubbed his temples, unable to even muster a glare toward the defense. The jurors, released from their duty, looked exhausted but resolute. They had delivered not just a verdict, but a statement. The state's evidence had not met the burden of proof. Judge Carter's voice carried over the din. The defendant is acquitted of all charges. Mr. Granger, you are free to go. The gavel struck. Chaos erupted. Reporters surged toward the aisle, shouting questions. Spectators spilled into whispers and shouts in praising the verdict, others condemning it. The bailiff barked orders for order, but it was like trying to hold back a storm out through it all. Thomas rose slowly. His legs trembled, but he stood tall. He looked first at Morton, his voice thick. Thank you. Morton shook his head. Don't thank me. Thank the girl. Thomas turned then, eyes sweeping the gallery. And there she was, Emily Harper, small and wide-eyed, clutching her stuffed rabbit as her mother held her hand. She wasn't supposed to be there for the verdict, but her mother had relented, sensing the importance. Emily's gaze met Thomas's. He pressed a hand to his chest in silent gratitude. Emily smiled shyly, then whispered into her mother's ear. Her mother leaned down, nodding, and Emily mouthed one word toward Thomas: free. Tears stung his eyes. Outside, the town was already aflame with reaction. Crowds gathered on the courthouse steps, some chanting in support of Thomas, others railing against the police. Reporters held microphones to anyone who would speak, gathering sound bites that would soon flood the evening news. The girl saved. Him. Police corruption exposed. Can we ever trust K9 evidence again? Inside the police department, the mood was grim. Officer Keller, once proud and steadfast, now faced an internal investigation. Officer Daniels had already been placed on administrative leave. Ranger, the loyal dog at the center of it all, lay in his kennel, unaware of the storm, tilting his head at the voices outside. And in her quiet home that night, Emily's mother tucked her into bed. Do you know what you did, sweetheart? Emily hugged Mr. Whiskers tight. I just told the truth. Her mother kissed her forehead. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. The trial had ended, but the story did not stop there. For weeks, Brookhaven was consumed by debate. Some praised Emily as a hero, her 2 words unraveling a miscarriage of justice. Others criticized the system, demanding accountability from the other police department. Editorials filled the newspapers, and lawyers across the state cited the state of Brookhaven versus Granger as a turning point in how courts handled K9 testimony. For Thomas, life after acquittal was not simple. The stigma lingered. Some neighbors still looked at him with suspicion. But he was free. He could breathe the open air, walk without shackles, hold his head up. He owed that freedom not just to a skilled lawyer, but to a little girl who noticed what everyone else ignored. As for Emily, she went back to being a child's school, dolls, hopscotch in the driveway. But in quiet moments, her mother would catch her stroking Mr. Whiskers and whispering, as if to remind herself, I told them. And so, the legacy of the trial was not just about the fallibility of evidence, or the mistakes of officers, or the failures of bureaucracy. It was about the clarity of truth, spoken without agenda. It was about 2 words. 2 words from a little girl that tore apart lies, toppled a prosecution, and set an innocent man free.